The year was 1883, and the land around the New Mexico territory stretched wide and endless, like a sea of yellow grass and red dust. The wind never stopped moving, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and old wood smoke. It was a lonely world, and on that land stood a small ranch owned by a man named Thomas Avery. Thomas had come west with dreams of building a good life. He had a wife, Clara, who was gentle and strong, and two small children who loved to follow him around the fields. Life wasn't easy, but it had meaning. Together they worked hard, raised cattle, and hoped for a future. But life on the frontier was unpredictable. When sickness swept through their small settlement, Clara fell ill. There was no doctor near enough, and before help could come, she was gone. After that, the ranch changed. The laughter of the children sounded hollow. The house felt colder, quieter, and heavier with each passing day. Thomas did his best to keep things together. He cooked what he could, cleaned when he had time, and cared for his children, Emma and Jacob, as gently as he knew how. But he was a man of the land, not one of words or soft touches. The loneliness weighed on him like a heavy coat. Winter was coming, and Thomas knew he couldn't keep going like this. He needed help. Someone to cook, to look after the children, to bring warmth back into their home. There were no women nearby who could take the place of his wife. Most families kept to themselves, and few single women lived that far from town. So one cold morning, Thomas saddled his horse and rode out to a trading post about 30 miles away. The trading post was a rough place, half store, half saloon, with men passing through to sell goods, buy supplies, or trade stories. Thomas wasn't much of a talker, but he listened as he drank his coffee. He overheard two men laughing near the counter. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, was bragging about how he had found help cheap from a camp far south. The other man raised his eyebrows. "Help? What kind?" "Women," the tall man said with a smirk. "Apache women. Some traders bring them in from the mountains, sell them off for a few dollars. They'll cook, clean, or do whatever you say." Thomas froze. His stomach twisted. He knew what those men were talking about, and it didn't sit right with him. But then he thought about his children. How little Emma cried for her mother at night, how Jacob had started skipping meals. He thought of the empty chair by the fire. When the tall man noticed Thomas listening, he grinned. "You look like you could use some help yourself, friend. I can talk to a trader for you. Won't cost more than $6. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared into his cup, watching the steam curl up like a ghost. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. Maybe he could offer the women a better life. Food, shelter, safety. Maybe it was an act of kindness. By the time he left the post that afternoon, he had made up his mind. 2 weeks later, a small wagon pulled up near his ranch. The trader was a hard-faced man with a quiet voice. Behind him sat 3 women wrapped in rough blankets. They looked tired, their faces unreadable. The trader said little as Thomas handed him $6 silver, nearly all the money he had left. When the wagon drove away, the sound of its wheels faded into the distance, leaving only silence. Thomas stood there, unsure what to say. The women stood together, not meeting his eyes. One of them, who looked a little older than the others, held her chin high, as if she wanted him to know she wasn't afraid. The other 2 kept their heads low. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "You can stay here," he said softly, pointing toward the house. "There's food and water inside. You'll have a place to sleep. I'll treat you fair." The women said nothing. They walked slowly toward the cabin, their feet stirring up the dust. That first evening, Thomas tried to act as if everything was normal. He cooked beans and bread, set the table, and invited them to eat. His children watched from the corner, whispering to each other. The women sat down but hardly touched the food. When Thomas offered a smile, they looked away. The days passed quietly. The women helped with chores, fetching water, cleaning, tending to the fire. They never spoke to him, at least not in a language he understood. They spoke softly among themselves at night, their words low and musical like the sound of wind through tall grass. Sometimes Thomas would pause at the doorway listening. He didn't know what they were saying, but he sensed sorrow in their voices. Despite the silence, the ranch began to feel alive again. The house was cleaner, the children were fed, and there was smoke in the chimney again. Emma even smiled once when one of the women, the youngest, showed her how to braid her hair. It gave Thomas hope. Maybe in time things would get better. But deep inside he felt uneasy. He had done something he couldn't explain or justify. At night, when he lay in bed, he thought of Clara, her laughter, her kindness, her faith. What would she think of what he'd done? He told himself he was saving the women from a worse fate, but doubt crept in like the cold through the cracks in the walls. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived with heavy winds and thin snow that covered the fields in pale white. The cattle grew thin, and Thomas worked harder than ever to keep them alive. The women stayed busy indoors, keeping the fire burning, cooking meals and caring for the children. Slowly, an unspoken rhythm formed in the house. One night, as Thomas sat by the fire with a worn Bible in his lap, the oldest woman came to stand near him. She pointed to a picture in the book, an image of a family sitting together at a table. Her eyes lingered on it, then she looked at him and said softly, "Home." Thomas nodded, unsure if she meant his home or hers. "Yes," he said, "home." For a moment there was understanding, quiet but real, but it didn't last long. The next week a neighbor stopped by to trade supplies. When he saw the three women working near the barn, he gave Thomas a strange look. "You're keeping them here?" he asked. Thomas frowned. "They're helping. They've got food, shelter." The man shook his head. "You don't own people, Avery. Folks are talking." That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat outside under the stars, watching the shadows of the women as they sat near the fire, whispering among themselves. The guilt he had tried to ignore began to grow heavier. He realized that even if he had meant no harm, what he had done was wrong. They weren't his to keep. They were people taken from their own families. He wanted to make it right somehow, but he didn't know how. He couldn't return them. The trader was gone. He couldn't send them away. They had nowhere to go. He began to hope that one day they might forgive him, or at least understand that he hadn't meant to hurt them. Still, the air around the ranch changed. The silence between them grew deeper. The women no longer met his eyes. The children sensed it too, a tension that couldn't be spoken. One evening, as the sun went down behind the hills, Thomas stood by the corral, watching the last light fade. He felt something shift in the wind, a sense that something was coming. He didn't know what it was, but it filled him with quiet fear. He turned toward the house, where faint voices drifted through the doorway. The women's voices, soft and steady, speaking in words he couldn't understand. And for the first time since Clara's death, Thomas Avery felt truly alone. Winter deepened and the land turned quiet under its blanket of snow. Days were short, nights were long, and the wind sang through the cracks of the old wooden house. Thomas Avery worked from dawn to dusk, his hands rough from the cold. The cattle needed care, the fences needed mending, and life went on, though the weight in his heart grew heavier each day. Inside the house, the three Apache women kept to themselves. They moved quietly like shadows, tending to the fire and caring for the children. Emma had grown close to the youngest woman, who braided her hair and taught her a few words in her language. Jacob, though shy, followed them around the yard, watching with wide eyes as they hummed soft songs while hanging laundry or grinding corn. Thomas watched all this with mixed feelings. The ranch had become warmer in some ways. There was food on the table, laughter in the corners again. But at the same time, a quiet wall stood between him and the women. They never smiled at him. They never spoke his name. At night, when everyone had gone to bed, Thomas sat by the fire thinking about the choices he had made. He had told himself he only wanted to save them, to give them safety. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his decision had been selfish, born not of kindness, but of loneliness. He had never asked what they wanted or where they came from or who they missed. Sometimes he heard them whispering softly after dark. Their voices were calm but full of emotion, like prayers carried by the wind. He wished he could understand their words. He wished he could say he was sorry. One cold evening, as Thomas returned from the barn, he saw the oldest woman standing outside under the stars. She was staring toward the distant mountains, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The snow glimmered faintly on the ground. Thomas approached slowly. "Cold night," he said quietly. The woman didn't move. After a long pause, she said one word: "Home." Her voice was soft, but the meaning hit him hard. She wasn't talking about his ranch. She was thinking of her people, her family, her real home, the one she had been taken from. Thomas nodded slowly. "I know," he said. You want to go back?" The woman didn't answer, but he saw the tears glisten in her eyes before she turned away and went back inside. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat awake listening to the wind beat against the windows. He felt torn between what was right and what was possible. The world outside was harsh and dangerous. The plains stretched for miles and Apache territory lay far beyond. He couldn't just send them away. They might not survive the journey. But he couldn't keep them either, not like this. As dawn broke, Thomas made a decision. He would find a way to help them return home, safely. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to make peace with his heart. The next morning, he saddled his horse and told the women he needed to ride to the trading post. He hoped to speak with someone there who might know where the Apache camps were, and whether it was possible to reach them. The women didn't respond, but the older one watched him closely as if trying to read his intentions. The ride was long and cold. When Thomas arrived at the post, he found the trader who had brought the women. The man was sitting by the fire, counting coins. Thomas told him straight. "I want to return them," he said. "They don't belong here," the trader laughed. "Return them? You paid for them. They're yours now." "They're not mine," Thomas said firmly. "They're people," the trader shrugged. "You can do what you want, but if you let them go, they'll never make it far. The plains are full of patrols and bandits. You'd be throwing away $6 and 3 lives. Thomas didn't argue further. He rode home with his mind racing. He didn't care about the money anymore, but the man's words echoed in his head. What if the women didn't make it back? What if he sent them to their deaths? That night he gathered his courage and spoke to the women. They sat around the fire, the children asleep nearby. He spoke slowly, hoping they would understand. "I want to help you go home," he said. He pointed toward the mountains. "Home?" The women looked at one another. The oldest spoke softly to the others in their own language, and for the first time, Thomas saw something in their eyes, a faint light, like hope. The next few days passed quietly. The women began to pack small bundles of food and blankets. They moved with a purpose that Thomas hadn't seen before. The children watched with curiosity, not fully understanding what was happening. On the morning of the 3rd day, the sky was pale and cold. Thomas loaded a small wagon with supplies. He planned to take them partway toward the foothills, close enough that they could find their people safely. He didn't tell anyone in the nearby settlement. He wanted no trouble. The women stood ready, wrapped in thick shawls. Emma cried when she realized they were leaving. The youngest woman knelt beside her, brushing the tears from her cheeks and placing a small carved bead in her hand. "Remember," she said softly. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He knew this was the right thing to do, but part of him ached at the thought of the children losing the only motherly figures they had known since Clara's death. They began the journey at sunrise. The road was rough and the wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ground. For hours they traveled in silence. The air grew colder as they neared the mountains and the snow began to fall again, light as feathers. At a small stream near the base of the hills, Thomas stopped the wagon. "This is as far as I can go," he said quietly. The women climbed down slowly. The oldest one looked back at him, her eyes calm now, no longer filled with fear. She placed her hand on her heart and nodded. A silent thank you. Thomas handed them the last of the food and pointed again toward the distant peaks. "Be safe," he said. "Find your home." They stood for a long moment, then turned and began walking toward the mountains. The snow fell heavier now, blurring their figures until they faded into the white horizon. Thomas stood there for a while, his breath misting in the air. He felt an emptiness inside him, but also something new. Peace. For the first time since Clara's passing, he felt like he had done something right. When he returned home, the ranch felt quiet but not hollow. The children asked where the women had gone. Thomas sat them by the fire and told them gently. They went home to their families. Emma nodded slowly, still holding the carved bead in her hand. Jacob leaned against his father's arm. The 3 of them sat together in silence, listening to the fire crackle. Weeks passed. Spring began to touch the land with hints of green. The ranch slowly came alive again. The cattle grew stronger, the children smiled more, and Thomas found new strength in his work. But every evening he would look toward the mountains and think of the women, wondering if they had found their people, if they were safe, if they remembered him not with anger, but with understanding. One morning, as he walked out to the barn, he found something tied to the fence post next a small wooden carving shaped like a bird. It was simple, but beautifully made. Thomas held it in his hand, his eyes misting. He didn't know how it had gotten there or when, but he knew what it meant. Freedom. He smiled faintly and placed the carving above the fireplace inside his home. From that day on, he told his children stories not of trade or hardship, but of kindness, courage, and the lesson he had learned, that every heart, no matter how lost, deserves to find its way home. And though the prairie wind still howled at night, it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like forgiveness.